extraordinary power. Man-made mountains, bodies torn to pieces, millions of people buried alive. This is the story of one of the most powerful and ruthless rulers history has ever seen, Qin Shi Huang's story. You may think that you are looking at an ordinary mountain right now, a mountain covered with trees that doesn't mean anything when viewed from the outside. However, there is a hidden deep secret underneath this mountain. The tomb of the Qin Shi, a ruthless ruler who carries a passion for immortality. It was 4 times larger than the biggest Egyptian pyramid when it was built, and you can't possibly even imagine inside. The tomb was built in shape of a palace, and its ceiling was covered with stars. Inside there were rivers of mercury, which represented the oceans, and they were creating a visual feast by reflecting the stars on the ceiling. Along with their clothes and personal belongings, the bones of dozens of maids who were forced to drink poison to death were discovered in different rooms of the tomb. However, none of these things we have mentioned so far are what makes this tomb so famous. The archaeologists have discovered an unexpected room while they were continuing their work. They realized that the room they were digging was the largest room of the tomb, and the scene they encountered was mind-blowing. Over 8,000 soldiers, who were made of terracotta clay, were waiting in a perfect order to continue Emperor Qin Shi's reign. This army was called Terracotta, and each of its soldiers' heights and faces were designed different than the other. The archaeologists encountered with different sculptures in different rooms as they kept digging. The chauffeurs and chariots with harnesses, viziers, servants, even musicians and jesters to entertain Qin Shi in his eternal sleep was unearthed. There were musical instruments, horses, armors, and weapons, each made of clay. To this day, only 8,000 of them is unearthed and on display, but many more continue to be found each day as the archaeologists dig up. Over 700,000 soldiers and 500,000 civilians were put to work in this construction, which considered as the largest burial complex in world history. But the emperor's tomb holds such a secret that it is hard for the human spirit to bear. The tomb was not built only with the construction materials. Hundreds of thousands Chinese was forced work to death under the hunger and harsh conditions. And those who were dead were mixed to the grout and used as a part of the tomb construction. Only the very lucky ones were buried in mass graves, a terrifyingly overwhelming power. So if Qin Shi's tomb is like this, what do you think his life was like? Date 246 BC. A unified Chinese empire does not exist. Instead, 7 kingdoms are in battle to rule the Chinese lands. A child who is only 13 years old ascends to the throne of one of these 7 kingdoms. A child who won't get out of trouble until he grows up. First disaster came by his own mother's hand. His mother had disguised a man named Lao Ai as a eunuch, and the ambitious lover attempted a coup against Qin Shi. But Qin Shi found out in advance and crushed the coup. Qin Shi tied his mother's lover Lao Ai, alive by his arms and legs, to horses and had them torn off. He had everyone involved in the coup buried alive with their families, and had her mother in a palace room which she would never get out. Qin Shi, who thought that he had asserted his authority by proving himself to his army and his people, now had only one goal, which is to assemble the other 6 kingdoms under his rule and form a one united Qing dynasty. He formed the largest army that ever existed in the ancient world by gathering 1 million Chinese young men rapidly. Forming an army was not enough. He trained these men, once simple peasants, and he managed to turn them into professional troops. Yan State, one of the 6 kingdoms which were falling one by one against Qin Shi, came with a peace offer accepting the defeat. They sent an ambassador to Qin Shi for diplomatic talks. The ambassador went up to the king's chamber. He was carrying the maps of the lands and peace contract. He opened the map and swung the poisonous dagger he hid towards Qin Shi's heart. But Qin Shi was a good soldier. After dodging the dagger with his cloak, he killed the assassin on the spot with his sword. And then he gave the grand order: destroy the Yan State, raid their lands, kill all the authorities, execute the soldiers, tear into pieces and murder both their families and those whoever tries to escape. It was around that time the famous musician Gao Jianli, who was a close friend of the failed assassin, had vowed to avenge his friend's death. He planned to take revenge by infiltrating a musical performance at the palace and killing Qin Shi while showcasing his art. But one of the Qin Shi's guards recognized Gao Jianli, thus found out Jianli's plan. However, the emperor didn't consent to the murder of such talented musician. He had the musician's eyes gouged out and ordered him to continue his musical performance. He even congratulated the musician after the show. After more than a decade of raids, Qin Shi brought the other 6 kingdoms under his rule and unified the Qing dynasty. What we call China today was Qing back then. That's where the name of the China comes from. He had now managed to make his name in history as the first emperor of China. But gathering the lands under one flag was just the first step. Much more was needed to become a single nation. So he had the alphabet, which had changed across the Chinese empire, reorganized into words and letters that meant only one thing and created a common Chinese alphabet. He also developed a common calendar, also determined the measures of weight, currencies, and prices. He even standardized the width of horse carriages to ensure common transportation on all Chinese roads. He created province and district system to prevent the other dynasties' reunion attempts and keep the empire in order. By dividing the country into 36 provinces governed by governors and subdividing them into districts, he turned his empire into a real state. Apart from his cruelty, Qin's most important characteristic was his meritocracy. He was not hesitant to invite competent scientists and viziers, even if they were citizens of an enemy country, and give them the responsibility to manage his projects. He changed the feudal system of taxation and created a new promotion system based on education, skill, and merit. He proved to everyone that in spite of all his cruelty, he was a successful ruler. Of course, we should not forget that he had the support of the enormously talented diplomat and philosopher Li Shi, who was Qin Shi's prime minister. He was the main counselor and mentor of the many of Qin Shi's ideas. Li Shi was really a strange man. One day he noticed that the rats in the toilet were thinner and hungrier, while the rats in the barn were full and overweight. Since everyone's life is different, there is no standard of honor. Like rats, people's values are determined by their environment, and both people and rats' lives depend entirely on random life events. It is better to ensure that people do their best, according to the situations around them, instead of always limiting morality to codes. Those ideas of Li Shi's impressed the emperor, and Li Shi served the empire as prime minister until his death. Emperor Qin Shi also accomplished one of the biggest projects in Chinese history. By building the first water canals, he managed to multiply agriculture in China 5 times. More than 1 million laborers were employed in this massive project, which resulted in the development of these agricultural lands. The project was such a success that even today, these agricultural lands are among the most fertile farmlands in China. But the problems in the empire were not over. So that, the forces coming from the Central Asia was ruthless and impossible to fight. They were Turks and Mongols. Turkish and Mongolian raids from Central Asia were wreaking havoc in the border regions, as they had been for hundreds of years. These raiders were excellent horsemen and archers from the harsh climate of Asia, and the Qing's troops were no match for them. These raiders were the children of the steppe. It was a literal chaos. While a group of them raiding the north side of the country, another group could pop up in the south, middle, or in any other region. Dozens of independent Turkish and Mongolian groups plundered and pillaged the border towns. Ancient dynasties tried to establish ties with the Turks through marriage and by granting various privileges to prevent these raids. So much so that a touching poetry from a Chinese princess reads as follows. "A distant corner of the world is where my family sent me, to marry a stranger and be exiled to a savage land. My palace is but a round tent, its walls woven from wool. Dried meat is my sole sustenance, kumi's my only drink. My heart aches as I dream of my homeland, shattered and torn. Oh, how I long to be the yellow swan that returns to her nest." The fierce raiders of the Central Asia left even Qin Shi desperate. He could never dishonor himself by giving privilege or forming a family tie with the Turks. He had a different and a permanent plan. a giant wall that will stretch from one end of the country to the other, the greatest structure in the history of mankind. The Great Wall of China, a wall that forged with blood, sweat, and tears. The dynasties before him built walls in small scales, but they were walls that could be effective against one another, and now a much bigger, much stronger wall was needed. Qin Shi tore down almost all of the old walls and recruited millions of Chinese as laborers to force them to work. The motto was, "Build and keep going." More than 3 million people worked in its construction, and more than 1 million people died during the construction. There are 10,000 towers in the Great Wall of China, and those towers were used both for the accommodation of troops and for signaling purposes. Each pennant raised by the soldier in the tower meant that 500 enemies were approaching. Qin Shi wasn't just building a wall. He had new cities built as outposts in the deserted areas of the wall. There were more than 1.5 million soldiers working and patrolling on the wall daily. Their supply was carried out with tremendous engineering and organization. Starting work at dawn in the morning and continuing heavy construction until midnight, the workers either died or committed suicide due to hunger and overwork. The dead were not wasted, but mixed into the grout of the walls. Important parts of the wall were also adorned with temples and palaces of such width and height that chariots could travel on them. The aim of the wall was not just to get rid of the Turkish and Mongolian raids. These aims included showing that the empire had become a united whole, sending punished rulers into exile, punishing them with hard labor, and preventing common people from fleeing the country. In the event of an attack, captured enemies were burnt and thrown over the walls or catapulted into the enemy to create psychological pressure. The 20 dynasties that ruled after Qin Shi continued to add to the Great Wall until the 17th century. Qin Shi had some other issues. The Confucian doctrine adopted by the Chinese people could cause them to question the judgment of the king and interpret the ruler as the servant of the people. Instead, he decided to replace it with a philosophy of legalism, which would enable him to establish a clearer authority. Both philosophies had their pros and cons. Legalism was a viewpoint that strengthened central authority, whereas Confucian doctrine was better suited to smaller administrations, such as counties. Qin Shi ordered that all books on Confucianism be burned. Anyone who obstructed, delayed, or hid the books should be exiled or buried alive. The biggest desire of Qin Shi was to be immortal. This was actually the common thought of all the great rulers in the history like Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan. I have achieved everything. I am as powerful as a god, and now I must find immortality. For this reason, he brought sorcerers from all over the world who claimed to be 1,000 years old, and alchemists who claimed to have found the elixir of life, either willingly or by force. He was having them buried alive, expecting them to prove their claims. Adding mercury to the wines he drank, with the suggestions he took from the books written by alchemists, who allegedly lived for thousands of years, caused his health to deteriorate. An alchemist had told Qin Shi that if he lived invisibly, he would be protected from evil spirits and become immortal. This led Qin to create a secret life by connecting 200 palaces in different cities with underground passages. A ruler with 200 palaces and the underground passages that connect them, an obsession beyond comprehension. By the year 211 BC, a rumor had begun to spread. It was suggested that a meteorite had fallen in an area in the lower reaches of the Yellow River, and this was a prophecy of the emperor's death. Qin Shi sent a diplomat to understand the situation. The meteorite had indeed fallen, but the prophecy had to be destroyed. All the people living in the area where the incident took place were massacred, and every single piece of the meteorite was collected and turned into dust by Qin Shi. 1 year later, in 210 BC, he died in his palace as a result of years of tiredness and the mercury he drank due to the alchemists. He was 49 years old when he died. He managed to change whole world forever by creating a force like Chinese Empire. He will be remembered as a ruler who built two of the greatest architectures in history and took the lives of almost 10 million people. There are those who claim that what is said about him is based on legends, But today we know that most of it is true. Qin Shi Huang, one of the cruelest but one of the greatest rulers the history has ever seen. And now he lies in eternal sleep in the huge tomb he built, a tomb that will astonish people even after 2,000 years. Please, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.